Okay, welcome to Seven Continents, One Story, and I genuinely cannot wait for this one.
Glad to have you with us today. This is going to be a good one.
I've been looking forward to this all week, honestly.
I'm Ethan, 13 Maltese, and way too obsessed with history for someone my age.
I'm Niels, professor of history, originally from Sweden.
And I'm Celine, joining you from Edinburgh, Scotland. I read far too many history books in my spare time.
Every episode, we go deep into a story from one of the seven continents. Ancient stuff, modern stuff, stories that actually change the world.
Stories that deserve to be told properly, not just as a footnote in a textbook.
Because history is full of moments that still echo today if you know where to look.
History just hits different when you know the full story. See you next time.
Welcome back to Seven Continents, One Story. I'm Celine, and today we're journeying deep into the Amazon rainforest to explore one of history's most contradictory chapters, a moment of extraordinary wealth and terrible suffering that transformed an entire continent. Imagine a city in the middle of the jungle, electric streetlights, opera houses with crystal chandeliers imported from Europe, tram systems running on paved streets, all surrounded by dense rainforests, thousands of kilometers from any major coastline. This was Manaus, Brazil, at the turn of the 20th century. But this splendor had a dark foundation. The rubber boom that built Manaus and transformed the Amazon also brought systematic enslavement, torture, and mass killing of indigenous peoples. Today, we explore both sides of this story, the wealth and the horror, the innovation and the exploitation. Stay with us as Nils, Ethan, and I take you to the Amazon during the rubber boom of 1879 to 1912.
Right. I have something fascinating for you both. A mystery artifact game.
Oh, I love these. What is it this time?
What if I told you I'm holding something that transformed the modern world? Something that made bicycles possible, that enabled the automobile revolution, that became one of the most valuable commodities on Earth in the late 19th century?
Something valuable from the late 19th century that transformed transportation. Are we talking about petroleum? Steel?
Not quite. This material comes from trees, specifically from the Amazon rainforest. It's white when it flows from the bark, but once treated with sulfur and heat, it becomes durable, flexible, waterproof.
Wait, is this rubber?
Precisely, and not just any rubber. This is a sample of Amazonian wild rubber, the kind that briefly made Manaus one of the wealthiest cities on Earth, the kind that drove men to commit terrible atrocities in search of it.
So this is from the Amazon rubber boom?
Exactly. Between 1879 and 1912, the Amazon basin experienced an intense rubber boom that reshaped its cities, economies, and peoples. At its peak, Brazil and its Amazonian neighbors supplied the great majority of the world's crude rubber.
I never realized rubber was so valuable. Like, I think of it as just normal tires, erasers, elastic bands.
Today, it is. But in the late 19th century, vulcanized rubber was revolutionary. Charles Goodyear perfected the process in 1839, heating natural rubber with sulfur to stabilize it against heat and cold. Suddenly, rubber could be used for belts, hoses, seals, waterproof clothing, and later pneumatic tires.
And demand must have exploded with bicycles and cars?
Precisely, Celine. From the 1870s, the bicycle boom created mass markets for pneumatic tires. Then came the automobile in the 1880s and 1890s, multiplying tire demand yet again. And at this stage, the best rubber trees, Hevea brasiliensis, still grew primarily in the Amazon, giving the basin a temporary near monopoly over supply. Let me take you there. The year is 1896. You're in Manaus, deep in the Brazilian Amazon. The city has just inaugurated its magnificent Teatro Amazonas, an opera house built with imported European materials, ironwork from Scotland, tiles from Alsace, chandeliers from France, marble from Italy.
An opera house in the middle of the rainforest?
Yes, and not just any opera house. The Teatro Amazonas seated 700 people in velvet and gilt. Its dome was covered with 36,000 decorated ceramic tiles painted in the colors of the Brazilian flag. The world's finest singers performed there, including Enrico Caruso, who sang in Manaus for astronomical fees.
But how? how did a city in the middle of the jungle become so wealthy?
Rubber. Natural rubber extracted from hevea trees in the surrounding forest. At the boom's peak, around 1910, Amazonian exports reached nearly 40,000 tons annually. Rubber barons sent their laundry to Europe. There are even stories, colorful, perhaps exaggerated, of cigars lit with banknotes and horses watered with champagne.
So there was incredible wealth, but you mentioned something darker?
Much darker, Ethan. This splendor was built upon systems of debt bondage, slavery-like labor, and genocidal violence against indigenous peoples and poor migrant workers. The rubber boom left dual legacies, enduring cultural achievements, and a long shadow of demographic devastation.
Nils, what was the Amazon like before this boom began?
Prior to the rubber boom, the Amazon basin was home to diverse indigenous nations: Bora, Witoto, Okena, Ashaninka, Shipibo-Kanibo, and many others. Their economies blended shifting cultivation, hunting and fishing, riverine trade, and complex spiritual relationships with forest landscapes. European arrival in the 16th century had brought epidemics, missionization, and sporadic slaving, but large parts of the interior remained beyond direct colonial control well into the 19th century.
So the Amazon wasn't really integrated into the global economy?
Not deeply. Brazilian independence in 1822 and the opening of the Amazon River to international navigation in 1866 gradually integrated the region into global trade networks. Exports, Brazil nuts, cacao, timber, medicinal plants, moved downriver to ports like Belém. Rubber extraction existed as a small-scale activity, but not yet at the boom's scale.
And then demand for rubber exploded.
Precisely. Export statistics suggest that Amazonian rubber shipments rose from roughly 2,000 tons in the mid-19th century to around 10,000 tons by 1879. Many historians date the onset of the first rubber boom from that year.
So who was doing all this rubber tapping? Like, how did they get workers into the rainforest?
That's where the story becomes very dark, Ethan. Across much of Brazilian Amazonia, labor relations were organized through a system called aviamento, a patron-client debt system that produced slavery-like conditions.
How did it work?
Merchants and estate owners, called patroes, advanced tools, food, and goods to rubber tappers. In return, the tappers were obliged to supply rubber and other forest products. The problem was the economics.
What do you mean?
Prices in company stores were heavily marked up, while the credit given for rubber was low. This made it extremely difficult for workers to clear their debts. They became trapped, bound to patrons, their mobility limited, their debts often inherited by their children.
So they were essentially slaves?
In practice, yes. Although some legal distinctions separated aviamento from chattel slavery, many human rights commentators and scholars describe it as debt bondage or peonage, stressing its coercive and often hereditary nature. Remember, Brazil had formally abolished slavery in 1888, but in the remote Amazon, enforcement was negligible. Now, while rubber barons built opera houses, there was a man who would expose the terrible truth of what was happening in the most remote extraction zones.
Who was he?
Roger Casement, an Irish-born British diplomat who became one of the history's great human rights investigators. In 1910, the British government commissioned him to investigate reports of atrocities in the Putumayo region, a remote zone straddling the Peru-Colombia border.
What did he find?
Systematic enslavement, torture, and mass killing. The Peruvian Amazon Company, owned by a man named Julio Cesar Arana, had established what scholars call terrorist slavery, regimes of domination that relied deliberately on terror and arbitrary violence to enforce production quotas.
What kind of violence?
Floggings, mutilations, rape, executions. Workers who failed to meet impossible rubber quotas were tortured or killed. Women and girls endured pervasive sexual violence. Casement documented entire districts where tens of thousands of indigenous people were reduced to only a few thousand survivors within a few years, a mortality ratio suggesting death rates well above 80%.
That's genocide.
Many human rights organizations and scholars now classify the Putumayo atrocities as genocide. Casement's 1911 report exposed these crimes to the world, galvanizing public outrage and contributing to the Peruvian Amazon Company's liquidation. You know, before we go further, let me tell you more about this rubber sample.
Yes, please.
Natural rubber comes from latex, the white fluid that flows from certain trees when their bark is cut. In the Amazon, the most valuable species was Hevea brasiliensis. Tappers would make diagonal cuts in the bark, collect the latex in small cups, and then smoke it over fires to coagulate it into solid rubber.
And this was all wild rubber, not cultivated?
Precisely. At this stage, virtually all commercial rubber came from wild trees in the forest. That's what made the Amazon so important, and what made the system so destructive. Workers had to penetrate deeper and deeper into the jungle, moving camps constantly, felling trees in some regions rather than tapping them sustainably.
So they were destroying the resource?
In some areas, yes. In western Amazonia, especially Peru and Colombia, operators often felled Castilla elastica and other species, stripping bark for latex in a few seasons and then moving on. This caucho system was even more destructive than the sustainable tapping of Hevea. Studying these historical booms and busts really makes you appreciate the value of stable, secure investments.
Absolutely. The rubber barons made fortunes, but when the boom collapsed, many lost everything. Wealth built on volatile commodities can vanish overnight.
That's why I'm genuinely glad we're partnered with Cyprus Real Returns. They offer something different, guaranteed 6 to 12% returns on Cyprus real estate, fully secured through the Cyprus Land Registry. Professional management handles everything, so it's completely hands-off.
And with Cyprus tourism booming over 4 million visitors annually and property values growing nearly 8% a year, it's a solid foundation for building wealth. Visit cyprusrealreturns.com to learn more. Nils, what happened to the Amazon rubber boom? Why did it end?
That's one of the history's great ironies, Celine. The boom collapsed because of a botanical transfer that had happened decades earlier.
What do you mean?
In 1876, a British adventurer named Henry Wickham shipped approximately 70,000 Hevea, Braziliensis seeds from Brazil to Kew Gardens in London. A small fraction germinated, and seedlings were sent to British colonies, Ceylon, Malaya, and others, for plantation experiments.
And these plantations eventually outcompeted Amazonian wild rubber.
Exactly. Asian plantation rubber was cheaper, more consistent, and produced at scale. By the early 1910s, plantation output overwhelmed markets. Amazonian wild rubber became uneconomic, prices collapsed, the boom was over.
So the Amazon lost its monopoly because Europeans had stolen its seeds?
That's how many Brazilians see it. Henry Wickham is often called a biopirate, who ended the Amazon's rubber wealth. But recent scholarship suggests that European empires were already searching for Hevea stock and might have succeeded by other routes. Wickham's shipment became a powerful symbol, but it was part of a broader colonial effort to control valuable tropical crops.
What's the legacy of the rubber boom, Niels?
It's a dual legacy, Celine. On one hand, the boom left remarkable cultural and architectural achievements. Teatro Amazonas still stands in Manaus, recently restored, hosting performances again, the Teatro da Paz in Belém, electric infrastructure that arrived earlier than in many other Brazilian cities, a cosmopolitan moment in the heart of the rainforest. On the other hand, the boom left demographic devastation. At least tens of thousands of indigenous people, plausibly over 30,000, and in some reconstructions approaching 100,000, died or were killed as a direct or indirect result of rubber-era slavery, violence, disease, and starvation. In some districts, more than half, and perhaps up to 90% of local indigenous populations were wiped out.
That's a terrible price for rubber.
Yes, the rubber boom exposed how extractive development can create extreme wealth while destroying peoples and ecosystems. It's a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century and continues today.
So what should we take from this story?
I think the rubber boom teaches us that wealth and suffering are often intertwined. The same trees that built opera houses also fueled genocide. The same global trade networks that brought luxury to Manaus also brought enslavement to the Putumayo.
And that progress for some doesn't mean progress for all?
Precisely, Ethan. The rubber boom also reminds us that resource booms are often fragile. The Amazon's dominance lasted barely 30 years. When Asian plantations matured, the boom collapsed, leaving cities like Manaus with grand buildings but no economy to sustain them.
And it shows the power of witnesses like Roger Casement, people who document atrocities and force the world to see what's happening in remote places.
Yes, Casement paid a high price for his principles. He was later executed by Britain for his role in the Irish independence struggle. But his Putumayo report exposed crimes that might otherwise have been forgotten. He showed that even in the most remote corners of the world, what happens matters.
What happened to the rubber barons? Did they face justice?
Largely, no. Julio Cesar Arana, the owner of the Peruvian Amazon company, avoided serious punishment and later entered Peruvian politics. Most rubber barons retreated to Europe or lost their fortunes when prices collapsed. The people who suffered most, indigenous communities and enslaved workers, received little compensation or recognition. What a journey through the Amazon today. You know, one thing I love about exploring history is it teaches us to think strategically about the future. That's why I'm genuinely glad we're partnered with Cyprus Real Returns.
They offer a strategic approach to building wealth, guaranteed 6 to 12% returns on Cyprus real estate, 100% secured through the Cyprus Land Registry with professional management handling everything.
The goal? Financial freedom to experience the history we love. With Cyprus tourism booming and property values growing nearly 8% annually, it's an opportunity worth exploring. Visit cyprusrealreturns.com to learn more.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Amazon rubber boom. We've explored how natural rubber transformed from a forest product into one of the world's most valuable commodities, and how that transformation built extraordinary wealth on a foundation of terrible exploitation. We've seen how Roger Casement exposed atrocities in the Putumayo, how Asian plantations ended the Amazon's monopoly, and how the boom left both architectural marvels and demographic devastation. If you'd like to learn more, there are excellent books about the rubber boom, Roger Casement, and indigenous histories of the Amazon. Check our show notes for recommendations. And remember what Niels always says, until our next journey through time, keep history alive. Thank you for joining us on this episode of 7 Continents, One Story.